Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going deep into something that might seem kind of, dry,
Mhm.
proofreading, but stick with us. It's actually way more interesting than you might think. And to help us, we'll be using the insights from this source here, 74 Proofread US.pdf.
It's funny, right? Proofreading, people think it's just this like last minute chore you got to do, but it's really where you're writing. It's where it all comes together. Like all your ideas, they finally get to like shine without anything getting in the way.
I totally agree. It's kind of like you've got this diamond, but it's all rough. And proofreading is like polishing it, making it sparkle. And our source material talks about how there are these, well, like different levels to this whole polishing process, right? Yeah, editing, and then there's peer editing, and then finally proofreading.
Exactly. Yeah. So
Yeah.
professional editing is like imagine you've got this writing coach in your corner. They're helping you with everything, your content, the way you've structured it, even the tone of the whole piece. It's really big picture stuff.
And then you've got peer editing, which is more like having a friend take a look, give you some honest feedback. They might catch things you totally missed, like maybe a sentence is just a bit clunky or you haven't used quite the right word.
And then finally, there's proofreading. And this is where you zoom in on all those little details, typos, grammar, all the punctuation stuff, those tiny things that can really trip up a reader, make your writing less effective. It's pretty amazing, actually, even pro writers. They rely on all three of these stages to make their work really shine.
So let's dive into proofreading itself then. Our source material, it goes into some of the most common errors that people make. And I think the first one they bring up is the sentence fragment. You know those sentences that just sort of, well, they just end abruptly?
Right, like the thought's not quite finished. Like imagine you see something like walking down the street on a sunny day. Okay, so it's descriptive, right?
Okay.
But it doesn't actually like express a complete thought.
And the problem with those fragments, especially if you use a lot of them, is they can confuse the reader. It's like trying to follow a recipe where someone's left out some steps.
Exactly. Now, sometimes people use sentence fragments on purpose for effect, like you see it
Yeah.
in poetry or creative writing. But most of the time, you really want to make sure those sentences are clear and they're complete.
Okay, so sentence fragments are a no-no. What about subject-verb agreement? Now, that's something I still mess up sometimes.
It's one of those things, simple in theory, but then you try to put it into practice and it can get kind of tricky. Basically, the verb in your sentence has to agree in number with the subject, singular subject. You got to use a singular verb.
So the dog barks, not the dog bark.
Yeah.
That's pretty straightforward, right?
Right. But it gets harder. Compound subjects, for instance. So, like, the dog and the cat chase each other. See, now you've got a plural subject, so you need chase, the plural form of the verb.
I can see how it can get tricky, especially when you start throwing in things like prepositional phrases or anything else that's separating the subject from the verb.
Exactly. It's about training yourself to, like, really see what the core subject and verb are, no matter how complicated that sentence gets. And our source here, it actually gives you some practice sentences, so you can really, flex those subject-verb agreement muscles.
Awesome. Okay, now, can we talk about apostrophes? I feel like these little guys cause so much confusion.
Oh, apostrophes. Definitely a common trouble spot. People put them in where they don't belong or leave them out entirely when they're actually needed. You just got to remember, okay, they have two main jobs, showing possession and contractions.
Like the dog's bone, to show that the bone belongs to the dog, versus, let's see, its, which is like a shortened version of it is.
Exactly. And one that often trips people up is when to use its versus its. So its is for possession and its, that one's always a contraction.
Okay, right. Like the cat chased its tail, but it's raining cats and dogs.
Mm,
Once you get those basic rules down, apostrophes are way less intimidating.
absolutely. All right, let's move on to another sneaky error that can mess up the flow of your writing. The comma splice. This happens when you try to stick two complete thoughts together with just a comma.
It's like, I don't know, trying to hold two big, heavy boxes together with a single piece of tape. It's just not going to work.
Exactly. You end up with a sentence that's, well, clunky, confusing. But the good news is there are some really easy ways to fix it. You can just add a conjunction after that comma, like and, but, or.
Or you could simply split it into two sentences. Problem solved.
Right. And sometimes you can even use a semicolon to connect them, but only if they're short and really closely related. Longer, more complex sentences, you're better off with one of the other solutions.
Okay, so we've covered sentence structure, subject-verb agreement, apostrophes, and comma splices. What else does our source material point out?
Well, they really stress the importance of being consistent with your formatting. Things like what font you're using, the spacing, capitalization.
Right, because if you're switching fonts all the time or capitalizing things randomly, it just looks unprofessional and it makes it harder to read.
Exactly. And one common error, especially for folks learning English, is putting a space before punctuation marks. You don't do that in standard English.
It's those little details that can really make a big difference in how people see your writing.
Absolutely. Speaking of how people see things, consistency is also key when it comes to the formality and the tone.
Right. You don't want to start off super formal like you're writing an academic paper and then suddenly switch to this really casual conversational style. It would be jarring for the reader.
It'd be like going to a job interview, all dressed up, suit and tie, and then halfway through you change into sweatpants. Your message might be great, but the inconsistency, it's distracting.
So, yeah, keeping that tone consistent throughout your writing is super important. What about capitalization? Any common pitfalls there?
Oh, you wouldn't believe how often capitalization errors pop up. Remember, the first word of every sentence, it gets a capital letter, and so does the pronoun I. Then you've got your proper nouns. So that's names of people, places, organizations. Those all get capitalized too. And don't forget about the important words in titles.
It's like a whole secret code figuring out capitalization.
Yeah.
But once you learn the rules, it becomes second nature.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about those typos and spelling mistakes. They can creep into anyone's writing, even if you've got a spell checker.
Ugh, tell me about it. Sometimes my fingers just can't keep up with my brain. And then there were those homophones, words that sound the same, but they're spelled differently. Those can trip anyone up, like affect versus effect, or there, and there.
It's like they're playing hide and seek in your writing.
So, okay, we've covered a lot of common errors here. What about actually catching them? What techniques can we use when we're proofreading?
Our source material has a great tip for this. Read your work out loud. I know it might sound a little weird, but seriously, it helps you catch mistakes your eyes would totally skip over.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You have to slow down when you're reading aloud, really focus on every single word.
Exactly. And as you're reading, listen for anything that sounds off, anything awkward or clunky or just plain wrong. Could be a comma that shouldn't be there, a missing word, or even a sentence that just doesn't flow right.
Like you're training your ears to pick up on the rhythm of the language.
I love that. And you know what else? Reading aloud, it can help you catch those homophones we were talking about, the ones that spell checkers miss.
Oh, right. Like there, and there. Yeah, those can be tricky even for experienced writers.
Exactly. When you read it out loud, you're more likely to hear the difference and catch that mistake.
Okay, so reading aloud is a great technique. Any other tips from the source material?
They suggest using a checklist when you're proofreading. Helps you stay on track, make sure you're not missing anything important.
A checklist, huh? That's a really good idea. What kind of stuff would go on a proofreading checklist?
Well, you definitely want to check for subject-verb agreement, right? Comma splices, apostrophe errors, those are biggies. You could also add things like making sure your verb tenses are all consistent, checking that your paragraphs are well structured, and that your tone is right for whoever you're writing for.
Like having a roadmap to guide you through the whole proofreading process.
Exactly. And the best part is you can tweak that checklist to match your own writing style and the specific mistakes you tend to make.
So it's like you're creating your own personalized proofreading tool.
Right. And as you get better at proofreading, you can add new stuff to the checklist or refine the things you've already got on there.
It's all about continuous improvement. Oh, and speaking of improvement, the source material also talks about the importance of keeping track of the errors you make frequently.
Yeah, that's so helpful. You start to recognize your own patterns, your own tendencies. Makes you a way more efficient proofreader of your own work.
Like turning those oops moments into learning experiences.
Exactly. It's not about, beating yourself up for making mistakes. It's about using those mistakes to become a better writer.
I love that. It's about the journey, right? Knowing that even the best writers, they're always learning and growing.
Absolutely. And that's what's so cool about language, It's alive. It's always changing, always growing. And as writers, we get to be a part of that.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Makes me realize proofreading isn't just about fixing errors. It's about being a part of that whole evolution of language.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just language, too. It's about communication, about connection, sharing ideas with each other.
And those are things that are, well, they're at the heart of what it means to be human. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of proofreading, what's like the one big takeaway you want our listeners to leave with?
I think the most important thing is just to remember that anyone can become good at proofreading. It takes practice, it takes patience. It's not about being perfect. It's about striving for clarity, for accuracy, and making sure your writing is effective.
And you don't have to go it alone either. Get feedback from others, use those oops moments to grow, and remember, proofreading can be a collaborative thing.
Couldn't have said it better myself. On that note, I think it's time to bring this part of our deep dive to a close. But remember, the journey to becoming a better writer, it never really ends.
Absolutely.
Mm.
So keep exploring, keep practicing, and make sure those proofreading muscles stay strong.
And most importantly, never stop believing in the power of your words to make a difference in the world.
Until next time, happy writing and even happier proofreading.
All right, let's take a look at some of these exercises that the source material gives us. Really puts these proofreading concepts to the test. So one of them focuses on spacing errors. Now, those might seem pretty minor, but they can really change how readable something is.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. Like when there's a space before a period or before a comma, it just looks, I don't know, it just looks wrong.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people don't even notice it, but it makes your writing look kind of sloppy, like you didn't really care.
Okay, so this exercise, it gives us a whole paragraph that's just full of these spacing errors, and we have to go through and fix them all.
It's like you're some kind of punctuation detective. And once you start looking for these things, you'll be amazed how often you spot them.
It's like a whole secret world has been revealed or something. So what other exercises are there?
Well, there's one that's all about formality and tone. Remember how we talked about being consistent with those things? This exercise really makes you think about that.
So what do we have to do?
They give you a paragraph, right? But there's one sentence in there that completely clashes with the overall tone of the piece, and you got to figure out which one it is.
Ooh, that sounds tricky. Like finding a needle in a haystack.
It's all about developing your ear for language, really paying attention to how different choices can create different effects. And this exercise, it really makes you think about something interesting. Proofreading isn't just about finding errors, it's about making sure the writing is good, that it's engaging, it's effective.
Right, because a sentence can be grammatically perfect, but still not really fit with the rest of the piece.
Exactly. It's where the art of proofreading comes in. It's not just about following the rules, it's about understanding how language actually works and using that to make the impact you want.
Okay, so we've got spacing, we've got tone. What other proofreading challenges does this source material throw at us?
Well, there's one that's all about sentence fragments, and I think this one's really helpful because it makes you think about the structure of a sentence, really break it down.
So we got to spot those sentences that are incomplete and then figure out how to fix them.
Exactly. And sometimes it's not just a simple matter of adding a verb or adding a subject. You might have to rearrange the words or even combine fragments to make a complete thought.
It's like each sentence is a little puzzle. I think this exercise is really valuable. It helps you understand, what actually makes a sentence grammatically correct.
Absolutely. It's training your brain to see those essential elements that make a sentence work.
Okay, what about apostrophes? Do we get to practice those little guys?
Oh, yeah. There's an exercise that focuses on them specifically, covers all the common mistakes. Using its when you should use its, adding apostrophes where they don't belong, that kind of thing.
It's like boot camp for apostrophes.
Exactly. And those apostrophe errors, they can make your writing look really careless.
It's like showing up to a job interview with a wrinkled shirt. It just gives the wrong impression.
Absolutely. So yeah, learning to use apostrophes correctly, it's a good investment for any writer.
Okay, we've got sentence fragments, apostrophes, dot. How about subject-verb agreement? Any exercises to help us avoid those?
You bet. There's one where they give you a bunch of sentences and they all have subject-verb agreement issues, and you got to spot the errors and fix them.
So we got to make sure all those singular subjects have their singular verbs, and the plural subjects, they get their plural verbs.
Exactly. And it really challenges you to look at the structure of each sentence, figure out what the main subject and verb are, even if there's a bunch of other words in between.
It's like a mental workout for your grammar muscles. And honestly, this is one of those skills that can really take your writing to the next level. When your subjects and verbs are all in agreement, your sentences just flow so much better.
Absolutely. Everything just feels more harmonious, more clear.
Okay, what about comma splices? Do we get a chance to practice fixing those?
For sure. There's an exercise where you have to find the comma splices and correct them. You get to use all those strategies we talked about, adding a conjunction, splitting the sentence, or maybe using a semicolon if the sentences are short and go together really well.
It's like we're comma splice surgeons.
Exactly. And comma splices, they're one of the most common mistakes that writers make.
And they can really mess up the flow of your writing. It's like hitting a speed bump every couple of sentences.
Absolutely. Being able to spot those comma splices and fix them, it's a really valuable skill for any writer.
Okay, so we've worked through exercises on spacing, on formality. We've got sentence fragments, apostrophes, subject-verb agreement, and comma splices. Wow, that's a lot of proofreading. What else is there?
Well, the source material wraps up with a section on formatting errors, and I think this one's particularly relevant for people who are learning English. It addresses this common issue of putting a space before punctuation.
Oh, right. I used to do that all the time when I was first learning English. I guess it just felt natural coming from my native language.
Exactly. But it's one of those things that can really make your writing look unprofessional. So this exercise, it's like a good reminder to double check that spacing, especially around the punctuation.
It's all about paying attention to those little details, right?
Yeah.
They can make a big difference in how people see your writing.
Absolutely. And you know what I think is really cool? That the source material actually includes an exercise specifically for this, shows how much they understand the challenges that English language learners face.
It's like they're saying, hey, we see you, and we're here to help.
Exactly. Now, there's one more exercise I want to mention, the one about formality and tone. It's a great example of how proofreading isn't just about, fixing errors. It's about making sure the writing is consistent, making sure it's appropriate for whoever's going to read it.
So, like, we've got this paragraph, right? It starts out formal, but then there's one sentence that's super casual.
Yeah.
We got to spot it.
Yep, that's it. It's like you're at this fancy dinner party, everyone's dressed up, and then there's that one person in jeans and a t-shirt. Nothing wrong with that, but it just doesn't quite fit the situation.
That's a great analogy. So it really highlights how important it is to think about your audience, think about your purpose when you're writing.
Right.
Something you'd write in a blog post might not work at all in, like, a research paper.
Exactly. So proofreading, it's about more than just catching those errors. It's about making sure your writing is effective, that it's tailored to the situation.
Okay, so we've worked through exercises on spacing, formalities, sentence fragments, apostrophes, subject-verb agreement, comma splices, and we've even talked about some stuff that's specifically helpful for people who are learning English. I think we've covered a lot. Where do we go from here?
Well, I think it's time to zoom out a little, start looking at some bigger questions about proofreading. Like, what do you think? Will technology ever replace human proofreaders?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, we've already got spell checkers and grammar checkers. They can catch a lot of stuff. But I don't know, can they really understand language the way a human can? Can they make judgments about style and tone?
That's the big question, isn't it? What do you think?
I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think technology can definitely be a useful tool. Like, it can help us catch those basic errors, But there are certain things that humans are just better at, like understanding subtle changes in tone or recognizing when a sentence is grammatically correct, but it just doesn't sound right.
Right, like a computer might flag a sentence and say it's wrong, but a human editor could look at it and say, well, it's technically correct, but it's clunky. Let's make it sound more natural.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of context. A human, we can think about the audience, what the writing is for, even the writer's own voice and style. A computer just can't do that. Not yet, anyway.
So it sounds like you're saying technology can be helpful, but it's not going to put human proofreaders out of a job anytime soon.
That's my take on it, yeah. I think there's always going to be a need for human editors, especially for writing, where clarity and style are super important.
Yeah, that makes sense. So AI can help us with the basics, but it's the human touch that really makes a piece of writing shine.
Absolutely. And you know what? I think that's a really encouraging thought for anyone who loves language, who loves the art of communication.
I agree. It's good to know that our skills, our expertise, they still matter, even in a world where technology is changing everything.
Now, before we move on to the next part of our source material, there's one more thing I want to point out. This idea of proofreading as a form of empowerment.
Okay, that's interesting. Tell me more.
So the source material talks about how proofreading, it's not just about fixing those errors. It's about taking control of your message, making sure it comes across clearly, effectively. It's about getting rid of those rough edges so your ideas can really shine through.
I love that. It's like taking ownership of your voice, making sure it's heard.
Exactly. And, that idea of empowerment, it really resonates with me. It speaks to how powerful language is. When we can communicate well, we can change things. We can share our ideas, connect with people, make things happen.
That's beautifully put. Makes you realize that proofreading isn't just some technical skill. It's a way to, like, amplify our impact, make our voices stronger.
Absolutely. And it's not just about our own voices either. When we proofread someone else's work, we're helping them to communicate better. We're helping to shape how their ideas are shared, how they're understood.
Wow, that's powerful. Makes you see proofreading in a whole new way. It's not just about finding those errors. It's about, like, contributing to knowledge, to understanding.
Exactly. I think it's a really inspiring way to think about what we do as editors, as proofreaders.
Mm.
We're not just fixing commas and apostrophes, you know?
Mhm.
We're helping to make the world more literate, a place where people can communicate better.
I love that. And speaking of making the world more literate, our source material has a whole section on peer editing.
Oh, yeah. It talks about how valuable it is to have someone else look at your work. A fresh pair of eyes can often catch things that you miss, even if you've read it 100 times.
It's like having another brain working on the problem.
Exactly. And they even suggest having a class list of commonly misspelled words. I think that's such a great idea.
That's brilliant. Makes it a shared learning experience. Everyone's working together to help each other become better writers.
Right. It's like a proofreading support group.
Mm,
And I think that collaborative approach is so important. It reminds us that we're not alone in this. We can all learn from each other, support each other.
I love that. It's like proofreading becomes this journey that we're all on together, not just some lonely task.
Exactly. And, I think that's really empowering for anyone who's ever felt intimidated by proofreading. It's not about being perfect. It's about being open to feedback, being willing to learn.
Absolutely. So we've talked about technology, about empowerment, about collaboration. Anything else from the source material that you want to highlight before we move on?
Well, I think those proofreading symbols that the source material provides are worth
Oh,
mentioning.
yeah, those symbols. They're like a secret code for proofreaders. So
Yeah,
much easier than writing out a whole explanation every time.
exactly. And they're super helpful if you're working with someone who maybe doesn't know all the grammar terms.
Right. Like, you can just use a symbol to show a comma splice or a
Mhm.
capitalization error,
Yeah.
and it'll get it right away.
It's like a universal language of proofreading. It doesn't matter what language you speak.
That's amazing. It makes you realize proofreading is more than just a skill. It's a way to connect with people, share knowledge, no matter who they are or what language they speak.
Absolutely. And, I think that's a really beautiful thing.
So we've explored technology, empowerment, collaboration, and even a secret language. Is there anything else you want to touch on before we wrap up this section?
Hmm. Well, I think it's important to talk about the mindset of a proofreader. The source material doesn't explicitly talk about this, but I think it's really crucial.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of mindset do you think is most helpful?
I think it's really important to approach proofreading with a sense of curiosity, with openness. Instead of dreading it or feeling anxious about it, it's about seeing those errors not as failures, but as chances to learn, to get better.
I love that. It's about accepting that writing is a process, that everyone makes mistakes, even the best writers.
Exactly. And I think that's a really empowering message, especially for anyone who's ever felt intimidated by proofreading. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn to grow.
Absolutely. It's about having a positive attitude and just diving in.
Exactly. When you approach proofreading with that kind of mindset, it can actually be fun, like solving a puzzle or going on a treasure hunt for those little errors.
I love that analogy. Makes proofreading sound so much more enjoyable.
Yeah.
And honestly, if you're dreading it, you're probably not going to do a very good job.
Exactly. So yeah, cultivating that positive, curious mindset, it's really key to becoming a better proofreader.
Okay, I think that's a great transition into the next part of our source material. It's all about specific techniques to help us catch those errors that are easy to miss.
Perfect. Let's dive in. So we talked about that mindset, right? Approaching proofreading with, a good attitude. But what about some actual strategies, like things we can do to actually catch those errors?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. We've got the right mindset, but how do we put it into action? What are some techniques that work?
Well, one of the simplest and honestly one of the most effective is reading your work out loud. Might feel a bit silly, but trust me, it really works.
Yeah, I've heard that advice before, but I have to admit, I don't always do it. Why is reading aloud so helpful?
It's like this. When you read silently, your brain kind of skims. It fills in gaps based on what it expects to see. But when you read out loud, you got to slow down. Pay attention to every single word, every punctuation mark.
Okay, so you're basically forcing your brain to be more focused.
Exactly. And as you're reading, really listen. Anything that sounds off, awkward, clunky, just wrong. Could be a comma that shouldn't be there, a missing word, even a sentence that just doesn't flow right.
It's like you're training your ears to pay attention to the music of the language, the rhythm of it.
That's a great way to put it. And you know what else? Reading aloud can help you catch those homophones, the ones that trip up even spell checkers.
Oh, right, like there, and there. I still get those mixed up sometimes.
Exactly. But when you read it aloud, you're way more likely to hear the difference and catch that error.
Okay, so reading aloud, definitely going to try that. Any other tips from our source material?
They suggest using a checklist as your proofreading. It helps you stay organized, make sure you're not missing anything.
A checklist, that's a great idea. What kind of things would go on a proofreading checklist?
Well, definitely the big ones, right? Subject-verb agreement, comma splices, apostrophe errors. But you can also add things like making sure your verb tenses are consistent, that your paragraphs are well structured, and that the tone of your writing is appropriate for your audience.
It's like having a little roadmap to guide you through the whole proofreading process.
Exactly. And the best part is you can personalize that checklist. Tailor it to your own writing style, the kinds of mistakes you tend to make.
That's a great tip. It's like having your own custom-made proofreading tool.
Right. And as you get better at proofreading, you can add new things to that checklist or change the ones you've already got on there.
It's all about getting better, right? Improving all the time. Oh, the source material also mentions keeping track of the errors you make a lot.
That's such a good habit to get into. When you start recognizing your own patterns, it makes you a way more efficient proofreader of your own work.
It's like those mistakes become learning opportunities.
Exactly. And it's not about being hard on yourself, you know? It's about using those mistakes to grow as a writer.
I like that perspective. It's all part of the process, right? Even the most experienced writers, they make mistakes. It's how we learn and get better.
Absolutely. And that's what's so great about language, right? It's always changing, always evolving. And as writers, we're part of that.
That's a really cool way to think about it. Proofreading isn't just about fixing those little errors, it's about being a part of something bigger.
Exactly. It's about communication, it's about connection, it's about sharing ideas.
And those are the things that, well, those are the things that make us human. So, as we wrap up this whole deep dive into the world of proofreading, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from it?
I think the most important thing to remember is this. Anyone can become a good proofreader. Takes practice, takes patience. And it's not about being perfect. It's about making your writing clear, making sure it's accurate, and making sure it's effective.
And don't forget, you don't have to do it alone. Get feedback from others, Use those mistakes to learn and grow. And remember, proofreading can be a team effort.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive. But the journey to becoming a better writer, that never really ends.
So true. So keep exploring, keep practicing, and keep those proofreading muscles strong. And for all of you listening out there, happy writing. And even happier proofreading.